In May 1945, the Soviet army entered Berlin. The red flag flew over the German parliament. Before that, the troops had crossed Poland and triumphed in the Battle of Seal, one of the last great confrontations on the Eastern Front. The war in Europe ended. The Soviet Union emerged strengthened and extended its presence over several countries in the eastern part of the continent. With the victory, a new stage began. The reconstruction, control of power, and organization of the system remained in the hands of those who had directed the war. The model was inflexible. The decisions were made in a centralized way and were not open to debate. With the years, some tried to maintain that course. Others tried to alter it. There were rapid downfalls. One was arrested and then executed. Another ended up relegated to a remote position. What did those who rose to power after the war do? And what was their fate? Joseph Stalin, from war leader to absolute power. During the Second World War, Joseph Stalin personally directed military operations as supreme commander of the Red Army. From 1941, he also presided over the State Defense Committee, concentrating political, military, and economic power. All strategic decisions passed through him. He directed key campaigns, such as the defense of Moscow and the Battle of Stalingrad, where orders prohibited retreat or surrender. His role was presented as decisive for victory and reinforced his total authority within the Soviet system. At the end of the conflict, the Soviet Union emerged as a military and territorial power. The Red Army controlled a large part of Eastern Europe. Stalin attended the conferences of Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam, where he reached agreements with the United States and the United Kingdom on the reorganization of the continent. He was presented as one of the architects of a new world order and, within the country, as the leader who had saved the homeland. After 1945, his attention focused on internal reconstruction and control of the socialist bloc. The Soviet infrastructure was severely damaged. Destroyed cities, collapsed railway networks, and generalized scarcity marked the post-war period. The state organized the recovery by means of centralized plans that gave priority to the heavy industry, the energy, and the military system. Consumer goods and social improvements were sidelined. Agriculture, maintained in collective farms, continued with low production levels and precarious conditions for the peasants. In the political sphere, control continued to be absolute. Stalin maintained the leadership of the party and reorganized its superior structure, substituting the electoral committee for a wider presidium. Although this formally widened decision-making, in practice he continued deciding alone. No leader had any real autonomy. The proposals were approved without debate, and internal differences were resolved by discrete reassignments or detentions. Ideological vigilance was also reinforced. The social sciences and culture were subordinated to the official doctrine. Writers, historians, and economists had to adhere to the imposed line. Any deviation was viewed suspiciously. A vision of the world centered on the fight against internal and external enemies was promoted. Censorship was strict, and propaganda campaigns exalted the role of the state and of the party as guarantors of stability. In Eastern Europe, the countries under Soviet occupation established governments controlled by local communist parties with Moscow's direct support. The initial coalitions were replaced by single-party regimes. In countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, political, economic, and cultural structures inspired by the Soviet model were imposed. Direct intervention in the internal affairs of these states was justified as a guarantee of security and ideological unity. The relations within the ruling circle were tense. Stalin did not name any successor nor promote collective leadership. Functionaries like Molotov, Kaganovich, Beria, or Malinov were used for specific tasks, but none had stable power. As he grew older, his distrust increased. In his last years, he launched anti-Semitic campaigns, such as the case of the doctors accused of conspiracy. Deportations of some ethnic groups were planned, though never carried out. The cult of personality continued its growth. In 1949, his 70th birthday was celebrated with mass events. His name was constantly mentioned in speeches, films, and school books. Despite limited public activity after 1948, he remained the system's center. He governed from his residence, surrounded by officials presenting reports, but without direct contact with most of the apparatus. In March 1953, he suffered a stroke. Several hours passed before he received medical attention. He died on the 5th. He left no succession instructions, nor had he clearly delegated responsibilities. His death generated immediate uncertainty. The closest leaders quickly organized a new distribution of power, fearing a lack of decisions could trigger internal conflicts. The structure he left was designed to function under his personal authority. Economic planning, political control, and foreign policy were based on centralized decisions and repression of dissent. Without him, the system lacked clear mechanisms for adaptation or renewal. The period after his death would be marked by attempts to redefine the country's direction without breaking with the model he had consolidated. Barrier between the core of power and execution. Beria entered Stalin's inner circle in 1938 when he was appointed head of the NKVD, the agency in charge of state security. His rise coincided with the height of the Great Terror. From that position, he became one of the Soviet system's most feared figures. Under his leadership, the repressive apparatus maintained surveillance of all social sectors. His reputation for brutality originated in Georgia, where he systematically ordered executions and tortures. In Moscow, interrogations under his command were known for cruelty, and his office became synonymous with immediate punishment. During the Second World War, Beria had no direct military role, but his power continued to grow. He was responsible for internal security, supervised mass deportations of minorities accused of collaborating with the enemy, and maintained discipline through NKVD control. He organized the execution of Polish officers in Katyn in 1940 and directed the administration of the Gulag camps, whose population was used as labor during the war. Though he rarely appeared in public, he participated in the most important decisions, always subordinate to Stalin, but with effective influence on the life and death of millions. After the victory in 1945, Beria was rewarded with more responsibilities. His rank within the government was consolidated, and he also began to get involved in strategic matters such as the Soviet nuclear program. He supervised the construction of testing facilities and controlled the human and material resources assigned to the atomic bomb. His management was considered efficient. In 1949, when the first Soviet nuclear test was successful, he received public recognition. According to witnesses of the time, he seemed satisfied, though restrained. During those years, Beria also participated in internal purges. Together with Molotov, he contributed to dismantling the Circle after his death. Several officials close to him were arrested and executed, reflecting the usual power struggles in Stalin's environment. Beria remained an ambiguous figure, useful for controlling the apparatus, but also feared by his colleagues in the Politburo. In his relations with Stalin, he maintained a publicly subordinate attitude. However, in private, Beria showed contempt for the dictator. After Stalin's death in March 1953, he did not hide his lack of respect. In the following days, he appeared active and self-assured. He was one of the most visible leaders during the funeral and participated in the initial distribution of power. He assumed control of the Ministry of the Interior, MVD, which at that time had also absorbed the former Ministry of State Security, MGB. This merger gave him unprecedented control over the political police, prisons, and party surveillance. From that position, he promoted immediate reforms. He released the doctors accused in the so-called doctors' plot and publicly announced that the evidence was false. He also proposed reviewing other previous trials, which allowed prisoners released from the Gulag. His intention was to reduce dependence on terror as a government instrument. These measures initially had some support in some party sectors, but also aroused alarm in others. In foreign policy, he proposed significant changes. He spoke of relaxing control over Eastern European countries, promoting a more flexible approach with communist governments. In secret, he even re-established contact with Yugoslavia, whose break with Stalin was considered a betrayal. He also proposed concessions to the non-Russian republics within the USSR to alleviate ethnic tensions. These actions were seen as attempts to gain political support outside the central apparatus. Despite his moves, Beria was considered a threat by his colleagues. His dominance over the security apparatus made him fearsome. It was said that he had compromising information about all Presidium members, accumulated during years of surveillance. Khrushchev and Molotov began to organize a plot to remove him. Beria, too confident, did not take precautions. In June 1953, during a Presidium meeting, he was arrested by surprise. Khrushchev had coordinated the operation with Marshal Zhukov, who was in charge of the military deployment. Beria was taken from the Kremlin in a car and placed under army custody. His detention was announced a few days later. On July 2nd, in a meeting of the Central Committee, his crimes were presented: abuse of power, ideological deviations, and, implausibly, espionage for the United Kingdom. The accusation was approved unanimously. The trial was held behind closed doors. Beria was convicted and executed in December of that year. With his fall, the party reorganized the security apparatus. In 1954, the MVD was divided again, creating the KGB as an independent institution in charge of intelligence and counterintelligence. These reforms were intended to prevent any single person from concentrating so much power again. The leaders who succeeded him took note of the methods that had allowed Beria's rise and tried to prevent their repetition. The figure of Beria summarizes the excesses of the Soviet system under Stalin. He was the executor of the purges, the architect of repressive control, and, later, the defender of a limited change that never materialized. His end was a direct consequence of the fear that he himself had sown. His time in power was as influential as it was brief in the post-war period. After his execution, his name was removed from official speeches and erased from public records. For decades, he was not officially mentioned in Soviet history. Molotov, the fleeting successor, and his political fall. Georgy Molotov was one of the leaders who rose highest within the Stalinist system during the war and the post-war period. His career advanced through technical and organizational functions, earning Stalin's trust for his efficiency in administrative tasks. During the Second World War, he participated in the coordination of the arms industry and in the mobilization of human resources for the front. Although he was not a prominent public figure, his influence grew quietly in the planning bodies and in the central offices of the party. At the end of the conflict, Molotov was included in Stalin's inner circle. His prominence increased especially after Zhdanov's death in 1948. Together with Beria, he organized a purge against Zhdanov's network of allies in Leningrad and other regions. Dozens of officials were executed, including senior officials from the electoral office. This episode reinforced his position as one of the possible heirs to the Soviet leadership. In Stalin's last years, Molotov was in charge of key reports and was appointed to deliver important speeches, which presented him as his official spokesman. At the 19-Party Congress, held in 1952, he read the Central Report on behalf of the Central Committee, while Stalin remained silent. This was interpreted as a symbolic act of delegation. However, there were no clear guarantees of succession. Stalin's concentration of power prevented any real autonomy among his collaborators, who had to strictly adhere to the official line. After Stalin's death in March 1953, Molotov was appointed chairman of the Council of Ministers and secretary of the Central Committee, which placed him as the new head of government. His vice presidents were Beria and Molotov. The rest of the Presidium maintained a collegial structure, but Molotov was initially considered the strongest leader. At Stalin's funeral, his speech was the most sober and political, a sign that he intended to project himself as a leader of continuity, but with a less repressive tone. In the first months, he promoted an image of controlled change. He advocated a policy of reducing military spending, increasing the production of consumer goods, and a more cautious foreign policy. In the Supreme Soviet, he presented a budget that reduced agricultural taxes and increased payments to collective farms. He also tried to promote an industry more oriented to the needs of the population, in contrast to the production model focused on weaponry that had predominated in previous years. However, these ideas met resistance. The structure of the party and state apparatus had been configured for decades, prioritizing the military and heavy industry sectors. In addition, within the Presidium, figures such as Khrushchev promoted their own projects, such as the exploitation of virgin lands, which ended up gaining more support among regional cadres and the most conservative sectors of the party in its economic vision. A tactical error weakened his position. In March 1953, he resigned from his position as Secretary of the Central Committee to focus on his role as head of government. This decision allowed Khrushchev to take control of the party, a power that soon proved to be more influential than that of the Council of Ministers itself. Although Molotov remained the formal leader, his ability to establish policies without party support gradually diminished. The relationship between Molotov and Beria was collaborative initially. Both supported the liberation of the doctors accused in the doctors' plot and favored reducing the repressive role of the police apparatus. However, Beria's accumulation of power in the Interior Ministry caused fear among the other leaders. Molotov supported the conspiracy led by Khrushchev that ended with the arrest of Beria in June 1953. This action temporarily reinforced his position within the government. After that episode, Molotov briefly reinforced his influence, but control of the party was already in Khrushchev's hands, who began to organize support against him. Throughout 1954, Malenkov's authority in the Presidium weakened. In February 1955, he was forced to resign as chairman of the Council of Ministers, replaced by Nikolai Bulganin, a Khrushchev ally. Although he remained in the Presidium, his role was clearly secondary. After his dismissal, he tried to form an alliance with Molotov and Kaganovich to curb Khrushchev's rise. In 1957, these three leaders led an attempt to remove Khrushchev during a Presidium meeting. Although they initially obtained the majority, the Central Committee was urgently convened and the coup was neutralized. Khrushchev consolidated his power, and the three were expelled from the Presidium. Molotov was demoted to secondary positions. In the following years, he was appointed director of a hydroelectric plant in Kazakhstan. He never held high office in the state again. His time in power was brief but significant. He represented a moderate alternative within the Stalinist structure, but lacked the political strength to impose a new course. His inclination toward a consumer-oriented economy, his proposal for more peaceful relations with the West, and his rejection of police violence set him apart from many contemporaries. However, his organizational weakness and lack of charisma prevented him from building lasting support within the party. Molotov, from the pact with Hitler to marginalization during the Khrushchev era. Vyacheslav Molotov became one of the most visible official voices of the Soviet Union on the international stage. As Commissioner of Foreign Affairs, he led key negotiations with the Western powers and represented the Kremlin at crucial moments in world politics. He was a central figure in the signing of the Non-Aggression Pact with Nazi Germany in 1939, and during the war, he remained a negotiator and spokesman at diplomatic conferences with the Allies. His career, which began in the regime's early years, positioned him as one of Stalin's most loyal collaborators. During World War II, he held a prominent position on the State Defense Committee. He participated in strategic decisions alongside Stalin, Molotov, and other senior leaders. He was responsible for signing international treaties, coordinating diplomatic missions, and maintaining relations with the Allies. He traveled to London and Washington, representing the Kremlin at key conferences. His rigid style and disciplined language made him a difficult but effective negotiator in the context of Soviet diplomacy. At the end of the war, he continued as Commissioner of Foreign Affairs. He directed foreign policy during the creation of the Socialist Bloc in Eastern Europe. He participated in the negotiations that imposed communist regimes in countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. He firmly defended Soviet positions against the Western powers in the United Nations Security Council and at international conferences on disarmament, borders, and economic cooperation. After Stalin's death in 1953, Molotov was included in the initial division of power. He was confirmed as Minister of Foreign Affairs and Vice President of the Council of Ministers. However, his figure began to lose influence compared to younger leaders such as Khrushchev and reformers such as Molotov. Although he remained in the leadership, his role was more conservative, and he often opposed the proposals for change that arose in the Presidium debates. As Khrushchev strengthened his control over the party, Molotov became increasingly isolated. Khrushchev's reformist ideas clashed with Molotov's defense of Stalin's legacy and the centralized model he had helped to build. In 1956, during the XX Party Congress, Khrushchev delivered his secret speech in which he denounced the crimes of Stalinism. Molotov tried to prevent this and proposed that the central theme of the Congress be Stalin, the continuer of Lenin's work. He failed to impose his view. Khrushchev had the support of most of the Presidium. Molotov was forced to listen to criticism of the period that he himself had shaped. He opposed the direction of the Congress, but could not reverse it. From that moment, his position visibly weakened. In 1957, together with Malenkov and Kaganovich, he led an attempt to dismiss Khrushchev during a Presidium meeting. They obtained a provisional majority to abolish the post of First Secretary, hoping to dissolve his leadership. But Khrushchev mobilized the support of the Central Committee, gathering its members in Moscow in a maneuver coordinated with Marshal Zhukov. The plenary of the committee supported Khrushchev and dismissed the three conspirators. Molotov was expelled from the Presidium and from the party secretariat. In a symbolic decision, he was appointed as ambassador to Mongolia. He went from being one of the most influential figures in the state to occupying a minor diplomatic post, far from the center of politics. This change represented not only his personal fall, but also the defeat of the old Stalinist guard in the new Soviet power balance. In the following years, Molotov lived in an ambiguous situation. Although he was not arrested or physically purged, he was excluded from active politics. His name was removed from the press, and his historical role was minimized in official documents. He did not participate in writing memoirs or in party events. In private, he maintained his defense of the model he had helped to build. He expressed no regret or revision of his actions during the Stalinist era. One of the most personal events for Molotov was the detention of his wife, Pelagia Zhimkina, during Stalin's last purges. Although she was rehabilitated in 1956, the episode marked his relationship with the rest of leadership. The liberation of millions of prisoners from the Gulag in the years after the XX Congress contrasted with his active role in the previous purges, which contributed to his continued exclusion from the regime's new political projects. His definitive exclusion occurred in 1961, when he was expelled from the Communist Party. The Congress of that year considered that his loyalty to Stalinism was incompatible with the party's current line. Although he had not held any position since 1957, the formal expulsion closed any possibility of rehabilitation during his lifetime. In the following years, he lived away from the media in Moscow under informal surveillance. He rejected interviews, did not publish memoirs, and limited himself to maintaining private contacts with former collaborators. He died in 1986 at the age of 96 without ever being officially rehabilitated. His career was one of the longest in the history of Soviet power. He was present from the regime's first years, participated in the most decisive decisions of the Second World War, and in the consolidation of the socialist bloc. His fall reflected the displacement of a generation of leaders whose loyalty to Stalinism no longer had a place in the Soviet Union's new political context. The reforms, contradictions, and dismissal of Khrushchev. Nikita Khrushchev was one of the most prominent Soviet leaders after Stalin's death. His political career had begun decades earlier with his participation in the labor movement during the First World War and his Bolshevik militancy since 1918. He ascended in the party structure after studying at the Industrial Academy of Moscow, and in the 1930s he became a key figure in Ukraine and Moscow. During the Great Terror, he supported the purges, although he also demonstrated his administrative efficiency. In the Second World War, he served as a political commissar on the Southern Front, participating in the defense of Stalingrad and other campaigns. Upon his return to Moscow, Stalin appointed him secretary of the Central Committee in 1949, with the aim of balancing the positions of Molotov and other party officials. This appointment brought him closer to the core of power in Stalin's last years. After Stalin's death, Khrushchev was appointed first secretary of the Communist Party, initially within a collegiate structure together with Molotov, Beria, and Molotov. Little by little, he consolidated his position, maneuvering to weaken his rivals. He actively participated in the detention of Beria in June 1953, an action that marked his affirmation within the political apparatus. From the beginning, Khrushchev advocated for a renewal of the system without abandoning the foundations of the one-party state. His first major project was the Virgin Lands campaign in Kazakhstan and Siberia, which mobilized millions of people. The initial result was an increase in grain production, although it would not be maintained in the long term. At the same time, he promoted an administrative reorganization that fragmented the central ministries and transferred functions to the regional economic councils, with the aim of boosting economic management. One of his most significant acts was the secret speech of 1956 at the XX Party Congress. In it, he denounced Stalin's crimes, criticized the cult of personality, and recognized the widespread abuses. This gesture marked a turning point in Soviet politics. At an internal level, it caused a commotion. At an international level, it weakened the socialist bloc's cohesion. Protests broke out in Polonia and Hungary, and the subsequent repression showed that change limits were still strictly controlled by the Kremlin. Despite his denunciation of Stalinism, Khrushchev retained elements from the previous system. He reinforced the role of the party as the guiding force of the state and maintained the structure of centralized planning. In the economic field, he combined technical reforms and volunteerist campaigns. In agriculture, he promoted kolkhoz expansion, the creation of sovkhozes, and the reduction of private plots. Between 1950 and 1960, wheat, milk, and meat production increased significantly. However, the model continued to be based more on political decisions than structural efficiency. In foreign policy, he tried reducing tensions with the West. He met Eisenhower and later Kennedy, advocating peaceful coexistence. However, his unpredictable style created uncertainty. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, he decided to withdraw Soviet weaponry without consulting the Presidium, which was seen as a retreat. Although he avoided a nuclear conflict, his unilateral management of the episode eroded his authority among the leaders of the party. At an internal level, he tried to reform the party apparatus. In 1961, he imposed mandate limits, a measure that worried many mid-level cadres. He also divided regional committees into separate branches for agriculture and industry, creating administrative duplication. These decisions increased discontent among local officials and within the Presidium, whereas reorganizations were deemed ineffective and arbitrary. Ideologically, he promoted an optimistic discourse on communism. He affirmed that the USSR would surpass capitalism in quality life. The massive construction of housing, the expansion of consumption, and the improvements in nutrition seemed to support this affirmation. However, structural imbalances still persisted. Priority continued to be given to heavy industry, and the reforms failed to change the regime's investment pattern. In 1963, a bad harvest forced cereal imports, which highlighted the limits of his agricultural model. Khrushchev also had repercussions on cultural life. The publication of critical works, such as A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Solzhenitsyn, was allowed. There was a brief period of openness in cinema, literature, and music. However, when some authors crossed limits defined by the party, restrictions were reimposed. Censorship was reactivated, although with less severity than during Stalin's time. His personal style caused divisions. He combined populist enthusiasm with abrupt decisions. He intervened directly in technical issues, ignoring experts. In the United Nations, he interrupted a speech by hitting the table with his shoe, which reinforced his image as an unpredictable leader. At the same time, he accumulated positions and sought personal recognition despite criticizing the cult of personality. His figure appeared daily in the press. and his family received political favors, such as his son-in-law's appointment as head of his dressing room. In October 1964, he was dismissed by the Central Committee's Presidium itself. His opponents, led by Brezhnev, Suslov, and Kosygin, argued that his leadership had been erratic. The dismissal was organized discreetly. Upon returning from vacation, he was taken to a meeting where he was asked to resign. He accepted without resistance. Aware that his time had ended, he was allowed to retire and lived in Moscow until his death in 1971, away from political life. Brezhnev: stability, stagnation, and decline. Leonid Brezhnev ascended in Soviet politics as part of the generation that followed the Civil War. Born in 1906 into a Russian working-class family in Ukraine, he joined the Communist Party in the 1930s, standing out for his discipline and adaptability. His ascent consolidated during the Second World War, where he served as a political commissar on the southern and Ukrainian fronts. After the conflict, his relationship with Khrushchev benefited him, and he was promoted to key positions in Moldova and later in the party's central apparatus. In 1964, he participated in Nikita Khrushchev's dismissal. He was appointed first secretary of the Communist Party, a position later known as General Secretary. He shared power with other leaders such as Kosygin and Podgorny in a collective structure, but over time he established himself as a central figure. His initial objective was to restore administrative order after the agitation of the prior years. He reversed several of the reforms of Khrushchev, reinstated the central ministries, and abandoned the sectorial divisions in the committees of the party. On the economic front, he favored continuity. Although he allowed Kosygin to promote some reforms oriented to decentralization, he blocked any attempt to alter the foundations of centralized planning. The initial growth of agriculture and industry between 1965 and 1970 reinforced his authority. However, the initial dynamism gradually stagnated. In the decade of 1970, the productivity diminished, the technological innovation was limited, and the bureaucracy became more rigid. The massive investments did not yield proportional results. Even so, a policy of relative welfare remained. The real salaries increased, the construction of housings was promoted, and the social services were extended. In 1980, the access to the domestic appliances and the basic goods had improved in comparison with the decade of 1950. However, structural imbalances persisted. Agriculture continued, depending on enormous subsidies, and the USSR became a habitual importer of cereals. The economic system depended to a great extent on the incomes coming from the exports of hydrocarbons, whose increase of the prices in the 70s avoided a serious fiscal crisis. In foreign policy, Brezhnev tried to maintain the Soviet Union's international prestige. He promoted détente with the United States, signing arms limitation agreements with Nixon and Carter. He traveled to Washington and received Western leaders in Moscow. At the same time, he actively supported revolutionary movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and increased military cooperation with allies like Cuba and Vietnam. In 1979, the invasion of Afghanistan marked a turning point in this policy, unleashing a prolonged crisis that deteriorated relations with the West and sharpened internal tensions. The cultural management of Brezhnev combined the selective repression with a limited tolerance. Although some margins of criticism were allowed in moderate forms, works that questioned the system or the Stalinist past were censored. The repression against dissidents like Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn was constant. The samizdat system became a clandestine channel for the circulation of unofficial ideas and literature. Political vigilance and self-censorship dominated Soviet intellectual life during this period. Under Brezhnev, the structure of power became a gerontocracy. The average age of the electoral office increased progressively, and generational renewal was blocked. The party apparatus was filled with civil servants promoted by Brezhnev during his years in Dnipropetrovsk, creating a loyal but uninnovative network. Important decisions were taken by consensus, avoiding open conflicts, but also preventing substantial reforms. This stability was interpreted by many internal sectors of the state as stagnation. At a personal level, Brezhnev cultivated the image of an affable leader, although he also accumulated personal privileges. He allowed nepotism within his family and tolerated high levels of corruption in the corridors of power. His health seriously deteriorated in the 1980s. He suffered multiple ailments, took medications continuously, and required permanent medical attention. Despite that, he remained in the position, supported by a retinue that feared the political repercussions of his retirement. The system's inertia prevented the preparation of an orderly transition. Between 1980 and 1982, his participation in public affairs diminished significantly. His appearances were sporadic, and his communication was limited. In practice, decisions were taken by figures like Andropov, Gromyko, and Chernenko in a non-official collective leadership. The absence of effective leadership increased disorganization. At the same time, reports about corruption scandals in his family began to circulate, promoted by political rivals like Andropov from inside the KGB. Brezhnev died on November 10, 1982. His funeral was formal, without public displays of mourning on the part of the elite. Although official honors were granted to him, his death was seen as a relief by many party leaders. He was buried in Red Square with the uniform of marshal and all his decorations. His time in government, which had begun with promises of stability and improvement, finished with a paralyzed system. Incapable of responding effectively to the economic, social, and political problems that were accumulating, Yuri Andropov, between the vigilance and the failed reforms, assumed the leadership of the Soviet Union in November of 1982 after the death of Leonid Brezhnev. His political trajectory was extensive. He was born into the bosom of a middle-class family in 1914. From a very young age, he joined the Komsomol and, after a constant ascent in the party apparatus, he was named ambassador to Hungary in 1954. There he was a direct witness to the Budapest uprising in 1956, an episode that left an indelible mark on his vision of the communist order and the necessity of political control. After returning to Moscow, he joined the Central Committee of the party, and a decade later, in 1967, he was elected by Brezhnev as head of the KGB. From that position, he exercised strict control over dissidents, foreign espionage, and internal stability for 15 years. He became one of the best-informed leaders of the system, with access to secret reports and surveillance networks. His leadership reinforced the KGB's role as a key instrument of Soviet power. In Brezhnev's last years, Andropov prepared to succeed him. He took advantage of the physical deterioration of the general secretary and used his influence within the security apparatus to bring to light the corruption linked to the environment of Brezhnev. In November 1982, he was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party in a relatively smooth process. Unlike his predecessor, he intended to act more decisively to reactivate the system. Andropov believed discipline was the basis for economic recovery. One of his first decisions was launching a campaign against corruption. He dismissed officials from key ministries, promoted trials against state employees, and reorganized the party apparatus. He ordered raids on workplaces, imposed fines for tardiness, and demanded constant attendance at work. These measures were received with skepticism by a population that had lived for years with the system's inefficiency and informality. Personally, Andropov was austere. He avoided excesses, rarely attended social events, and projected a sober image. He was methodical, demanding of his collaborators, and reserved. Although he promoted some symbolic gestures, such as a factory visit in Moscow, his public appearances were limited. He did not promote a personality cult and avoided appearing frequently in the media. His style contrasted with Brezhnev's, who had favored a permanent public image. Ideologically, he did not break with traditional Marxism-Leninism. He maintained the slogan of developed socialism and rejected any substantial revision to the system. However, he recognized a need to adapt state management. He allowed some room for debate within the party and commissioned Mikhail Gorbachev and Nikolai Rizkov to draft a report on regeneration. Although the document proposed improvements, Andropov did not allow more audacious ideas from independent academic circles, such as the Novosibirsk group, which warned of the Soviet system's structural inefficiency, to be incorporated. One of his most notable initiatives was promoting new cadres. He supported the rise of younger figures such as Gorbachev, Ligachev, and Rizkov. He reorganized the party's central apparatus to reduce the influence of the older officials who had been promoted during the Brezhnev era. His goal was to create an environment favorable to change without provoking internal confrontations. His strategy was functionally reformist, but without altering the essential political structure. In foreign policy, he regained the initiative. In 1983, he proposed a formal agreement to the United States to avoid attacks against the member countries of their respective military alliances. He also tried to reactivate the détente, which had stagnated since the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in 1979. However, his image in the West remained linked to his past in the KGB. Ronald Reagan identified him with the empire of evil and rejected Soviet proposals. Tensions intensified even further after the shooting down of Flight KL-007, a South Korean commercial plane that entered Soviet airspace. The episode triggered a secret crisis during which Andropov ordered a state of maximum nuclear alert. Convinced that the United States might be preparing an attack during this period, his health deteriorated rapidly, as he suffered from chronic kidney disease that forced him to spend long periods in convalescence. From the spring of 1983, he stopped attending Politburo meetings regularly. His communications were made through notes sent by his aides. In practice, power began to pass to other members of the Presidium, especially Konstantin Chernenko and Mikhail Gorbachev, who alternated in the presidency of the meetings. Although he preferred Gorbachev as his successor, he could not secure that outcome. In one of his last writings addressed to the Central Committee, he expressed that preference. But the document was altered by Chernenko's supporters before its official presentation. Andropov died on February 9, 1984. He had only spent 15 months in power. His administration was brief, but generated expectations of renewal that were ultimately not fully met. Upon his death, many reformers considered him a transitional figure. For some, he represented the opportunity for slow but steady reform. For others, he had not gone far enough. During his brief term, he managed to dismiss a fifth of the first provincial secretaries, improved some industrial indicators, and allowed a limited circulation of reformist ideas within the party. However, his cautious approach, lack of time, and poor health limited the scope of his plans. Konstantin Chernenko, a weak leader at the end of an era. Konstantin Chernenko was elected General Secretary of the Communist Party in February 1984 after Yuri Andropov's death. His appointment was a compromise within the Soviet leadership. Although he was seriously ill, he was considered someone who would not change course or alter the balance between the different factions in power. He did not represent a new project, but the continuation of the conservative line that had been outlined during the era of Brev. Chernenko was not an outstanding or charismatic figure. He had built his career within the party apparatus, mainly in administrative roles. His relationship with Brezhnev, dating back to the 1950s, allowed him to ascend to high positions in the 1970s. He was secretary of the Central Committee since 1976, and he joined the Bureau of the Central Committee in 1978. He always worked in the background, without visible personal ambition. When he assumed leadership, he was already in very poor health. During his brief term, he did not promote major changes. He did not propose reforms or reverse previous decisions. The government acted with little initiative. The only significant measure was continuation of a project inherited from previous plans to divert a river in Siberia. It was a costly initiative with dubious environmental impact, typical of past technical approaches. No new economic policies or proposals to modernize the system were discussed. His state of health prevented him from attending most meetings. When he appeared in public, he gave short speeches or had others speak for him. Important decisions were made collectively or left pending. The country's problems continued to accumulate. Low agricultural production, inefficient industry, lack of innovation, and social discontent. None of these issues were actively addressed by the leaders. In that context, other leaders began to gain prominence. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had been promoted by Andropov, began to coordinate the meetings of the Secretariat and the Pilot Office when Chernenko could not attend. With a younger image and proposals to review economic management, he became a visible figure within the apparatus. Without breaking rules, he began to build support without directly confronting the Secretary General. Within the ruling group, there was no consensus on the succession. Some, like Viktor Grishin and Grigory Romanov, tried to position themselves as heirs, even organizing public events to gain prominence. However, none managed to gather enough support. Chernenko's image served to maintain balance, although everyone knew his leadership was temporary and could not last much longer. The Central Committee also did not show much enthusiasm for his election. When he was confirmed in office, the reaction was lukewarm. There were no ovations or long speeches of support. Most understood it as a provisional solution to avoid internal disputes. In reality, the country was still without clear direction at a time when urgent economic and social decisions were needed. Meanwhile, drafts of the Economic Policy Commission by Andropov continued to circulate among advisors. Some younger leaders, such as Rizkov and Ligachev, used them as a basis to discuss possible adjustments to the management system. No deep reforms were yet discussed, but an internal agenda began to take shape with ideas departing from traditional approaches. Chernenko's health deteriorated rapidly. He spent long periods in treatment and could not maintain a regular schedule. In early 1985, his appearances were almost non-existent. Decisions were made in his name, but under the practical leadership of others. The functioning of the government depended on informal agreements between the most active members of the Politburo, especially Gorbachev, who presided over several sessions in his absence. He died on March 10, 1985. His death caused little reaction. The funeral was modest, without great displays of emotion. He had been in office for just over a year, without leaving behind important decisions or new proposals. He was the last leader directly linked to Brezhnev's generation. His rise to power marked the end of an era that had lasted 2 decades and had been characterized by immobility and a preference for control over transformation. The succession was resolved immediately. The next day, Gorbachev was elected General Secretary of the party. The reforms of Mikhail Gorbachev, the crisis and the end of the Soviet Union. He assumed leadership of the Soviet Union on March 11, 1985, after the death of Konstantin Chernenko. He was the youngest leader to hold that position since Stalin. Born in 1931 to a peasant family from southern Russia, he spent his youth on a kolkhoz and worked in the countryside before studying law at Moscow State University. Upon returning to Stavropol, he began working within the Communist Party apparatus, thus beginning his political career. In the 1970s, he was promoted to senior party positions, and in 1980, he joined the electoral office. From the beginning, Gorbachev expressed his intention to renew the Soviet system. In the first months, he promoted cadre rotation, replacing veteran leaders with younger figures. In the economic field, he launched a campaign against corruption and tried improving productivity. However, he soon realized these measures were insufficient. The crisis was structural and required more profound transformations. In 1986, he introduced 2 key concepts, perestroika and glasnost. The first, meaning restructuring, referred to reform of the economic and administrative system. The second, translating as opening, implied allowing greater freedom of expression and criticism. From then on, censorship decreased and public debates arose in the media, universities, and cultural institutions. Gorbachev did not intend to dismantle the Soviet system. His goal was adapting it to the new conditions. He wanted to preserve the Communist Party, but with new practices. He supported laws allowing the creation of private cooperatives and some autonomy for state companies. He also promoted internal elections in the Soviets with more than one candidate per position, something that had not occurred since the regime's early years. The reform was not well received by all. Many within the apparatus feared losing privileges. In 1987, several of Gorbachev's allies in the Politburo began to distance themselves. Even so, he continued onward. He allowed the return of the dissident Andrei Sakharov and supported the publication of books critical of the Soviet past. In 1988, his influence in the Central Committee consolidated, and he was elected president of the Supreme Soviet. In foreign policy, Gorbachev met with Presidents Reagan and Bush. He unilaterally reduced the size of the Soviet army and withdrew troops from Afghanistan. He declared that the countries of the Warsaw Pact could elect their own governments without the intervention of Moscow. This decision marked the beginning of the collapse of communist regimes in Eastern Europe. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and soon after, communist governments were replaced in almost all countries of the bloc. Although Gorbachev did not directly promote these changes, he did not prevent them either. His policy allowed a non-violent exit from communism in Europe. This attitude was celebrated in the West. He received numerous awards and recognitions and was, for a time, one of the world's most popular figures. However, within the USSR, his image differed. Many saw him as responsible for the disorder and economic decline. Between 1989 and 1990, the Soviet republics began demanding more autonomy. In the Baltic states and the Caucasus, nationalist movements emerged. Lithuania declared its independence. In other republics, such as Ukraine and Georgia, demands for separation grew. Gorbachev tried to preserve national unity through a new union treaty, but support for the central government continued weakening. At the same time, Boris Yeltsin emerged, having abandoned the Communist Party and leading the opposition from the Russian Republic. He was elected president of the Supreme Soviet of Russia and became Gorbachev's main rival. While Gorbachev tried to preserve the USSR, Yeltsin advanced toward the establishment of an independent Russia, and the rivalry between the two further deepened the division of power in the Soviet Union's last years. In August 1991, a group of conservative leaders attempted a coup. Gorbachev was isolated at his vacation residence. The coup failed thanks to the resistance led by Yeltsin in Moscow. After the attempt, Gorbachev's power was seen as even more weakened. The Communist Party was suspended, and the republics began to declare their definitive independence. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR. The following day, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. He had governed for 6 years. During that time, he tried to change the system from within, but ended up being the leader who presided over its disintegration. He is remembered as a reformer who opened spaces for freedom, but did not know how to control his decisions' consequences. For more than 40 years, the Soviet leaders who came to power after the end of the Second World War shaped the country's destiny. Some tried to preserve the model they had helped to consolidate. Others sought to modify it from within. Some concentrated absolute control and fell suddenly. Others promoted change but faced a system that resisted any transformation. The passage of time did not bring a continuous path. Some remained in power for years. Others were dismissed within a few months. Centralized planning, constant surveillance, and obedience to the party remained fundamental pillars. Although each leadership left its own mark, the era of those who had led the state since the victory over Germany came to an end with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. None managed to guarantee stable continuity. Their trajectories reveal how power was organized, how it was maintained, and how it ended up disappearing.